Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Biochar in the Woods. We have a really full afternoon of fascinating panelists for you. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our partners and sponsors, U.S. Forest Service and local partners in Butte County, California. Our first speaker this afternoon, and we divided the afternoon up into several panels. So the first panel is about project logistics and economics. And so our first panelist is Laurie Schoonhoven. And Laurie is the National Forester for the Nrcs, Natural Resources Conservation Service. She holds a master's degree in forest resources from Penn State and has over 21 years of experience working with federal, state, and nonprofit partners to educate and provide assistance to woodland owners. Her work focuses on national forest policy and collaboration with partners to provide technical and financial assistance to private forest landowners interested in maintaining healthy forests. NRCS is a wonderful agency for supporting all the conservation practices that we would like to do, and they're doing their best. So can we go ahead and share your screen, Laurie?
There we go.
All right.
We should be good to go. So thank you, Kelpie, so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. So what I'm going to be going over is NRCS conservation programs, and then we have a soil carbon amendment conservation practice, as well as the biochar production enhancement. But I want to start by talking about our conservation programs. So the Farm Bill gives NRCS the authority to apply conservation program funds on private, non-industrial private forest lands. And we in particular have two programs that I'm going to be focusing on today. The first one is the Environmental Qualities Incentive Program, EQIP. It provides financial and technical assistance to farmers, ranchers, and private forest landowners to address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits. Agricultural producers and owners of non-industrial private forest land, as well as tribes, are eligible to apply. And in general, landowners are expected to pay a portion of the cost to implement conservation practices. And the level of financial assistance varies based on the program. And I'm going to be going into more detail on that in the next slide. So for EQIP, financial assistance is up to 75% of the estimated cost, 90% if the state has determined that it's a high priority resource concern. It is if you're working with, or if they're working with historically underserved producers, or it's source water protection. The Conservation Stewardship Program encourages producers to undertake additional environmental or conservation efforts, activities, or to improve, maintain, or manage existing conservation activities. Financial assistance is 100% of the estimated cost, and you'd have to implement that with the associated EQIP practice, and we pay 10% for the EQIP practice. So NRCS has 12 payment schedule regions. States are clustered based on similar costs, and payment schedules for practices and enhancements are based on the estimated typical cost for implementing each practice in a region. So I want to really make sure that you understand it's the estimated typical cost. You know, when you think about if you're going to have your house painted, you know, you're going to get multiple estimates, and some might come in low, some might come in high, and some might come in the middle. So when we estimate, you know, we take that into consideration, but it is basically an estimate. It's not based on actual cost. And so when a landowner contracts with NRCS to implement conservation practices or enhancements, the NRCS field office provides the landowner with a copy of the contract that includes the total financial assistance that we will be providing. The landowners can use this information to negotiate with contractors. When you have an agreement with contractor, you pay the landowner, or I'm sorry, you pay the contractor for their services, and then the NRCS field office will confirm the practice or the enhancement was properly implemented, and they'll pay you the amount that was outlined in the contract. So I want to get into our first conservation practice. It's the soil carbon amendment 336. This is brand new. It was an interim practice. And so since it is a relatively new practice, I'm going to quickly highlight our review process. So we always encourage states to develop innovative practices. And when they propose one, we allow them to have it as an interim practice. They can have up to 3 years to implement that interim practice. It's like a trial period. And then when it's over, we review the data. We determine, should it become a permanent practice, or can it be integrated into other practices? Or if it is going to become a permanent practice, we certainly integrate any data or implementation or requirements they may have developed as a result of implementing the practice. Permanent practices have a standard review process. It starts off with an internal review within the NRCS, and that's a 45 days. Publication to the Federal Register for public comment, which is 30 days. Review and response for public comments are then addressed. And then once the practice standard is finalized, it's published in our National Field Office Technical Guide, which is available on the web. And right now, we are at the internal review process. We did actually go through one internal review. We got significant comments back. So because there were significant changes, it is now going through a second 45-day internal review process. And we're hoping to get that into the Federal Register. When we do that, I'll certainly let Kelpie know. As noted, it was an interim practice. It includes adding biochar, and compost, or carbon amendments to soil. It's available for all land uses. Exceptions are where undesirable changes to plant communities may occur, like some range areas, and tests are, or when nutrients would not be used. So when we want to make sure that what is being done is actually improving soil health. So as a result of that, landowners are going to be required to do a soil test. You're also going to need to test the amendments and also test the biochar, and that's so that we can make sure what's already there, what's going to be going into the soil will actually improve the soil health and not be detrimental to it. Compost has a separate amendment specific requirements, and then chromium is added to biochar requirements because it is required for the International Initiative Standardized Product Definition and Product Testing Guidelines for biochar. But the EPA does not include chromium in heavy metal requirements, so sludge applications are not required for all amendments, but we are requiring it for this one. And then there are some exclusions. So when we talk about producing biochar, we don't want biochar produced from everything. So we don't want crop stovers or straw used to produce biochar, and not all woody residue, because you may want some woody residue left on the ground to provide wildlife habitat or for soil health. And excess woody residue is mainly what we want to be used for biochar production. And how we determine that is based on the woody residue treatment conservation practice. When we are considering this practice, we also need to consider the cumulative impacts of repeat application, because once again, we want to make sure that there's not going to be additional harm to the soil if there are repeated applications. For that reason, we include monitoring, and when you apply biochar with greater than 60% carbon, you need to have a low hydrogen to organic carbon ratio, and this is directly related to the residents' time stability for biochar for the soil carbon sequestration. And then we're to help support states in implementing this practice, we're going to be developing fact sheets for biochar and compost, developing frequently asked question application guides to include cropland and forest land applications, and other NRCS supporting documents. And now I want to go over our enhancement that's actually been in place for a few years. Biochar production from woody residue. And as I noted earlier, conservation stewardship program enhancements are used to do a step above an existing conservation practice. So normally with woody residue, they can chop it up or shred it, they can remove it, or they can burn it. But by producing biochar, you're doing more, you're adding additional benefits. It's applicable on forest and associated ag land because associated ag land is usually the area around fields or crop fields. And so sometimes there could be trees in those areas. Its purpose is to reduce wildfire risk. It needs to be implemented with woody residue treatment, and the woody debris has no commercial value, and it's adequate woody material. And as I noted earlier, adequate woody material needs to be left to maintain wildlife habitat and also potentially for soil health. It's created on site with biochar kilns. Biochar production will not be detrimental to the site. Soil and water resources will be protected. It needs to comply with state and local permit requirements for particulate matter emissions, smoke and dust, and ozone emissions. And it can, and producers who, or landowners who do this enhancement can use a soil amendment on their own land or as a manure treatment. Some considerations is that when you are doing this, NRCS will work with you to identify suitable biochar production site. That's to ensure we're protecting the soil, we're protecting the streams. We'll also help you create a biochar site safety plan. This ensures that it does not run away and become a wildfire. You are required to acquire all necessary approvals and permits for this. And also we encourage, or you need to maintain safety procedures and restrict the area to ensure maximum safety when producing the biochar. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and turn it back over to Kelpie. So thank you again.
Thank you, Laurie. That's really good to get all that straight from the horse's mouth. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come here and talk to us directly about these programs. So thank you so much. Let's see now. I want to now introduce our next speaker, Ken Carloni, botanist and forest ecologist. Ken received his PhD in forest ecology from Oregon State University, where his doctoral research focused on the use of landscape fire by the indigenous peoples of Southwestern Oregon. He taught a wide range of biology and natural resources classes at Umpqua Community College from 1987 to 2018, and partnered with the OSU College of Forestry to develop the Natural Resources Associate of Science degree at UCC. Since retirement, he's focused on ecological restoration and biochar kiln design and testing as the education program chair of the U Creek Land Alliance Incorporated. The YCLA has recently completed a 12-acre NRCS-funded oak habitat restoration biochar project, with more projects ongoing. His experience in flame cap kiln design and construction and in the logistics and best practices of multi-acre integrated biochar production has led to consulting work in Oregon, California, Massachusetts, and Guam. Can you share your screen for us? Ken, is everything okay there? And we're going to hear from Ken again later today in the last program. But this is his first presentation for us.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kelpie, for organizing this. And I've been enjoying all the speakers so far. And so I'm going to talk about integrating biochar production into your land stewardship practices. And I'm going to be using examples from the U Creek Land Alliance's project. We had a 32-acre Nrcs oak restoration project, 12 of which involved charring the slash to make biochar. And we are a working forest. Our mission is to conserve and restore the historic habitats and native biodiversity, while at the same time generating high quality goods and ecological services. We're focused on research, training, education, and recreation for participants of all ages. And so just to give you an overview of what one would need to go through in order to plan and implement a biochar project, planning, looking at a landscape level analysis, and then looking at funding, and I'll be talking more about that, equipment and logistics, kiln design, field gear, water. We've been hearing some of that today. Feedstock management, which I'm going to be concentrating on quite a bit, discussion of green versus dry fuels, kiln operation, and loading, firing, dry versus green, quenching, and then biochar distribution. And I don't have time to talk about all of that stuff, so I'm going to concentrate on these aspects. So in the first section, I'll talk about money matters, that is funding possibilities, and then feedstock handling best practices to minimize your expenses in producing biochar. So public sources, and Laurie just outlined Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we had a great experience with this project. But I will say that since we began in 2018, the personnel at NRCS, our local office, has almost entirely changed, and the technical assistance from the Oregon Department of Forestry has changed. And so, so folks that have come after us have had a different experience than we had, but I can't say enough about our experience with the NRCS. Everything went beautifully, and we had a really successful program. We were getting, they were paying us $4,700 an acre to do the char, and $502 an acre to do the thinning. We got creamed on the thinning, but we broke even on the biochar, and we were able to sell some logs. So the whole project broke even, and actually we got some decent rock on the road now. But my my advice is to get it in writing. This is new. Biochar is new to most of the folks that are in the NRCS and their technical assistance from the Oregon Department of Forestry. And so we did a lot of education along the way. We educated ourselves because we were the first project in Oregon to use this CSP. And so we learned along the way. We traded that information with folks in the agency, but those folks have mostly changed now. So it's kind of an ongoing give and take process that you're gonna want to keep going. And so at the bottom here, I say there's an urgent need for more trained contractors and consultants, and hopefully some of you who are on this webinar today will fill that niche. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe we're doing the very first project with them in their Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. After our experience and success with the NRCS program, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has gotten interested in biochar as well. And so we're 1.5 acres into a 5-acre project with them. And a lot of the slides that I'll be showing you are from that project. Oregon Department of Forestry just dumped an enormous amount of money out in the landscape resiliency program. U Creek has applied for $550,000, and we're considered to be a small grant, probably too small. We probably won't get the grant because they're looking for multi-million-dollar projects to do a huge amount of resiliency work in a short period of time. But anyway, our project does involve work with youth, and it's Oregon Senate Bill 762 that set this whole thing up, and that's one of their priorities. And we're going to do 32 acres of biochar to treat the slash that comes off those 177 acres, assuming that we're successful. Private sources, of course, there are private foundations and conservation-minded landowners, but right now, biochar can't pay for itself because of the extra work that's involved above and beyond the sort of hand pile and burn kind of contracts. So I'll talk about that a little bit more, especially in my second session. So what are the steps you go through? Feedstock handling, obviously you're marking your material. Out in this area here, there's a big oak back in there and you can't even see it. So here's one of our fallers out, dropping the trees. These are slash piles, fortunately not on our property. But what I would say about that is that I would stay away from machine piling because it is a real bear to take that stuff apart. We did some machine piling as one of our early mistakes was to machine pile on our property after we did some initial conifer thinning work. And be careful when you're creating your slash piles. I mean, when you're creating slash in the field, because the last thing you want to do is be, waist deep in slash like this, trying to, saw your way through this stuff to get material into a form that you can get to your kilns and then get into your kilns. So in our project here, this is the last 4 acres of the 5-acre project that we're doing. Here's an old growth stand here, and we have a good problem there, and that is that we have a pair of spotted owls nesting in there, but that is a problem for us because we have to work around nesting season. It's also potential marbled murrelet habitat, and if they haven't surveyed it, they assume the birds are there. So we have to dodge some endangered species here. Again, it's a good problem to have, but it does hamper our ability to operate. So you can see that we've got some about 50 to 60-year-old reprod in here. It was natural. It came in after the ranch had been clear cut and then went bankrupt in the 60s. And so we've got some 60-year-old timber in there. We will like to clean that out because there's a bunch of oaks embedded in there and other hardwoods. There's a couple of big madrones in there, and feather that meadow back toward the old growth forest there. So standing back in the meadow and looking at that forest, you can see that there's a lot of, that those oaks are heavily encroached with young conifer. And in the absence of fire or grazing, the conifers win, at least on our stand. And but up here, if you can see this underneath the banner up above there, if possible, separate your non-merchantable thinning from your merchantable harvest. So looking at our, our potentially merchantable trees in the back, some of those will stay, as, if they're not encroaching on any of the oaks, they'll stay. Or in some cases, we will girdle them for wildlife trees. So you can see now, after we made our first pass, all of that is 4 or 5 inch material that we've pulled out. And notice that contrary to the work that we just saw in the redwoods, ours is not perfectly neatly stacked, but it is out of the woods and in a place where we're going to set our kilns up on a flat spot right here and be able to do the work to that feedstock to cut it up into smaller pieces right at the kiln site. And we're also going to char that green. So, I mean, it's freshly down now, and we'll char it within the next month or two. And some of the trees that are just growing right up inside the oaks, those are the obvious trees that we girdle for wildlife trees because we can't get them out of that crown anyway without damaging the oak or hanging them up in there. So girdling trees for cavity nesting birds also avoids the damage to those legacy trees. And what I've been doing lately is using this sling to swamp the material out of the woods, where I throw down a 1-inch strap. And this is a whole tree. That's a 4 or 5-inch tree, 25 feet probably. And I just threw that sling over my shoulder and pulled that thing out of the woods whole, so that rather than dicing up your material out in the field and pulling individual branches in, the more whole trees you can pull out of a stand, the more efficient you're going to be. We also have some cables that we use. And another thing I want to mention is that we've had really great luck with cordless chainsaws. They've really grown up. They're, I've been falling 6, 8, 10-inch trees with these things. And as long as you keep your battery supply up, they work really nicely. You fire them up. Don't even fire them up. You just press the button for 20 seconds, put them down, work for 2 minutes, pick them up, press the button for 30 seconds, put them down. So they're really efficient instead of, jerking on a chainsaw rope the whole time. And then the other thing, this is in transit as we speak. This is a capstan winch, as opposed to the conventional cable winch on a drum, where you have to run that cable out, choker, whatever it is you're going to do, and then pull that back. Beauty of capstan winches is that you use arborist rope, static rope that doesn't stretch, and any length, 100, 200 feet, it doesn't matter, because the slack at the end, you throw around that curved drum on the capstan winch, and the friction causes that rope to be able to be drawn toward your vehicle that this is. So this has got a winch. You can trailer hitch. And so we can put it on the trailer hitch on our truck, or put it on the trailer hitch on the pallet forks on our tractor, to be able to get that material out of the wood. So again, the conventional wisdom, we've talked a little bit about this, that feedstock has to be drier than 25%. But our experience, and that was the first 6 acres of char we did, was dry. But then in order to try to increase the efficiency, we did an experiment on the next 3 acres, charring green materials straight off the stump. And that's now all we do, because the feedstock can be charred green. And I'll show you some data in the next session later on this afternoon. But charring slash straight off the stump minimizes handling effort and lowers fire danger when the fuel is drying. So the best situation you can have is to have your fallers and your swampers and people who are doing the charring all working together, so that your swampers are just behind your fallers, and then your charring is right behind your swampers. And the other thing too is to try to train your fallers to not just dump everything across each other, which is what you do in a production situation. If you were going to haul those merchantable logs out of there, the more directional falling that you can get your fallers to do, with the butt end of the log facing in the direction that you want to take it, the more efficient your work is going to be. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we've discovered along the way in terms of what we feel are best practices in terms of getting the material out of the woods. And in the second session, I'll talk a little bit more about flame cap kilns. Some will be a little bit redundant from earlier presentations, but we'll talk about design, operation, and kiln testing. So
great. Thank you so much,
my
Ken.
story.
That's awesome. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the chat right now in response to your green feedstock. So,
okay.
And we'll talk about that in the Q&A later. I wanted to see if Mark Vander, could you just open your mic and say something so I can make sure we can get your audio? Well, actually, now I don't even see.
To unmute him.
Okay, unmute him, please. And then, Mark, could you just pipe up for a sec?
Yeah, he has to hit the button to unmute. I've requested he unmute. It should have popped a button up on his screen.
All right. Mark, you were unmuted before. Maybe he stepped out for a minute. All right. Well, our next, let me go ahead and introduce our next panelists, and they're just going to be speaking to us live from their kitchen. This is two forestry contractors, Joe Pongratz of Pongratz Forestry. Joe's the owner of Pongratz Forestry, a forestry contracting company that specializes in habitat restoration, fuels reduction, prescribed fire support, and biochar projects. Joe has studied biochar as part of his education with Siskiyou Permaculture and has assisted with biochar projects with the Long Tom Watershed Council and with local small woodland owners. Joe has been doing this work since 2017. His goal is to preserve and enhance landscape health and diversity and to help prepare the land to receive good fire. And Joe, if you want to go ahead and share your screen while I introduce Dan Hanson of Nighswander Resources, LLC. He's the owner of that forestry contracting company that specializes in habitat restoration, forestry, fuels reduction, and biochar projects. Dan has worked with Joe Pongratz on several biochar projects with the Long Tom Watershed Council and private landowners with contracts with NRCS. Dan has been doing work in restoration and wildfire since 2006 and was formally introduced to biochar methods in 2018. His goal is to add capacity to address the complexities of our rapidly changing forests with planning and grunt work. All right, so Dan and Joe, can you go ahead and share your screen?
I think we're just talking. We don't have slides.
Yeah, I know. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm
No,
confused. There's your faces. That's what we wanted to see.
yeah, there you go.
All right, very good. So take it away, guys.
All right. Well, I guess I'll start. So we're just going to describe as contractors, sort of helping a landowner in a specific situation, implement some biochar practices, and describe some of the challenges that we experience and things we've learned from that. So in this situation, the landowner had a pretty unmanaged forest, and there's a lot going on with it. There's some storm damage, and he had a contract to clean up some of that storm damage. There was a lot of thinning that needed to happen. And so there's kind of layers of different practices happening at the same time. And including that, we had, but he applied for the CSP program, and a piece of that was to do some biochar. And but the situation was fairly complicated. We were going to do some biochar in the forest stand itself, not on these nice organized landings that you saw in some of those images earlier. It was just moving an Oregon kiln along a road with an excavator, and then bringing in material from the sides of the road, into the kiln, and then treating it there. So we've both had experience with biochar. We have a lot of common sense in the woods. We understand fuels reduction. So we thought, oh yeah, we're experienced contractors, and that's part of what's in the NRCS program. They want experienced contractors to do it. So we thought, okay, we'll get the Oregon kilns and we'll do this. But quickly we started learning that it wasn't quite as clear as we hoped it was. So the landowner was having his own communications from the beginning with the field agents for NRCS about this biochar practice. And so already there was direct verbal communication with a couple of different field agents. There was the NRCS field agent, there was an ODF technical assistant, and they were having their own conversations. And then we got involved, and we were not really totally integrated with those conversations until we were already starting to make biochar. And so yeah, we were kind of in a pickle there, but we just did our best, and kind of created, there was some issues with the assessment of how much biochar we created, and how much slash was left over. And I don't know if Joe wants to jump in here with some of his own thoughts on how this got set up.
Yeah, it's an important consideration. Like if you're a landowner and you're looking at hiring a contractor, like if you're going to enter into the NRCS program and you want to do some of these things, and a lot of landowners are like handy and you can do it yourself and really pumped to just like really be the bottom liner. And occasionally you need help. And so like you need to sort of think like, do you need technical assistance like consulting, like one of the, the many great folks that are on this presentation today? Or do you just need like some muscle, some machine abilities to help move some stuff around, like skilled felling? Like Ken said, having good fallers is often going to make or break some of your material handling concerns. But in this particular case, there's different parties and they're all on different pages. So you've got like the landowner, and then you've got NRCS, and you've got ODF, and then you have us, and trying to get everyone on the same page. If it were a different program, like some of the other stuff that we do all the time, like, thinning and fuels work, I mean, that's like, we've done that a lot. And as time goes on, you just get to learn, you can look at the canopy and sort of judge the right density and, the amount of fuel on the ground and things like that. Because those are established practices that are pretty easy to, to get with because we've done it so much. But the biochar being a new program, there was a lot of interpretation that happened kind of between the different parties involved. And sometimes we are relying on the landowner to communicate with NRCS and or ODF and then relay that information to us. And if you've ever played the telephone game, you might remember that things sometimes get a little bit confused. So having that solid documentation about, like in particular things, like the quantity of char produced, there's not really any metric on that, but we received a little bit of pushback on that on this one particular project. And then like diameter of feedstock, there was a little bit of, there was different things told to us at different times by different people about the appropriate amount of the size class of material that should have gone into the kiln, and then the stuff that was left over on the forest floor. And in this particular stand, of course, it was way overstocked, had a lot of storm damage, ended up, still being quite a decent amount of material on the ground that was above the size class of the biochar. So all these things kind of come together, and, they make it a challenge to sort of communicate and get things implemented in a good way. And of course, terrain is everything. Like I'm looking at Ken's picture of that nice oak and all that material laid out on the flats. And that looks pretty nice because some of the stuff, I mean, we're working in some spots that's pretty steep. And if you get on a 30-degree slope and all of a sudden, all that stuff becomes a lot more challenging. So really thinking about where a biochar program is going to get implemented, like terrain wise, like, are you on like landings? Like, do you have good roads? Is it a really steep access, like above the road, you're going to be pulling material down, or trying to pull material up to a road? All those considerations kind of like play into the cost effectiveness of biochar. And sometimes I think you can really get close to cost even, but sometimes with terrain and things, it's like it's really labor intensive and really difficult.
Yeah, and you saw from Ken, saying get it in writing, and we couldn't recommend that more. And ideally, you would get it in writing, and at that same point, have a document that everybody, the field agents, the landowner, and then any contractors can all reference as you go ahead with making the biochar. We didn't have that, and so if you look online, you can find NRCS documents from different district offices around the country with specifications, but really it all comes down to your local agents and how they're going to assess your project, and they have a lot of subjective control. And if everybody's not clear, then you can easily get into a kind of a power struggle where you have, again, it's that telephone thing where it's not in writing. You said one thing, so all that can really present challenges. And you can imagine, with the amount of labor it takes to make biochar on a landscape scale, as you've seen people describe, and then the amount of money that's available for reimbursement. Ken was saying $4,700. That's in line with some other numbers we've seen. So you can imagine that by the time you're involved with the project and you've put all that money and effort in, hiring people, or even just doing it all yourself, you kind of have a lot at stake. it's not just a thinning operation where you're lopping and scattering and moving quickly through the forest. It's a involved thing. And so not having that to point to, it kind of left everybody scrambling in a way. And as contractors, we're kind of objective about this. We want to help the landowner or a client reach the goals they're making, whether it's through a program with financial assistance or just whatever they want. But then once all that gets kind of jumbled and we're trying to be the steady hand, if we're not the one involved in these conversations, we don't really have we can't give the backup that we want to give to basically say, hey, we have our own experience making biochar. Let's work together with the field agent to some kind of agreement. And then if we run into issues based on what we've written down, we can talk about that and then work that through without things kind of devolving into a controversy and then everybody kind of just wants to walk away, which is kind of what we experienced. And it was sad because it didn't have to be that way, but it's understandable given how messy the forest was. This is a novel forest practice that is not widely accepted. Unfortunately, we're all here to kind of promote it. But the reality is you have individuals who might be responsible for administering this stuff who don't really have experience, and maybe maybe that doesn't feel good to them mentally to being asked to administer something they don't have experience with. And I could understand that. But again, if the contractors who have experience are involved from the very beginning, like Kim was saying, you get everything in writing, then you can kind of work as a team to work that out. And then the pressure isn't on just one person to be the authority or the landowner having to push back or any of these things. So I'm not sure what Joe has to add to that, but.
Yeah, just also quantifying, like I said, the appropriate place to get the maximum effect from a biochar enhancement, because there's the amount of fuel remaining, it was said about habitat, which I think is very important. Often in these program or in projects, we'll leave woody debris, or lop and scatter for forest health and soil building. Sometimes it's not worth the soil disturbance to pull a bunch of wood out. Other times fuel reduction is really necessary, or it's a prairie or savanna restoration, which we do a lot. And it's just, you can't leave a ton of woody debris out there. So having some different standards about what's the appropriate amount of fuel loading left on a site after you've done this work, as well as maybe having some metrics of how much char you should produce, given the amount of feedstock you have on a site. As more data comes in, I'm really curious to learn more of those things and apply them to other sites, because so many sites are different, and there's a wide range of forest types that we're all working in, and climates and all that. So, but I think, bottom line, like we said, is just communication, bringing in people early, kind of knowing whether you, as a landowner, if you're going to have a consulting forester, or if you're just going to sort of be that go-between between NRCS, ODF, contractors. Communication is just really paramount. And I'm glad that, Ken hit on a lot of that and a lot of good technical implementation stuff too. So, we're just glad to be here and be able to share some of the stuff with you.
Another point that I think was coming up with some of the description of from Laurie earlier about what the goals of biochar are. I mean, some of that's what we're all figuring out together. And one of the things is how much fuel do you leave on the ground? How much woody debris is helpful for the forest ecosystem to leave? And that can be in contradiction to the prescription with biochar. So that's kind of the really specific stuff that really matters, because if you're trying to say, okay, every single thing that's 4 inches and lower in this area that we're biocharing must go. I mean, that's a lot, and that's very just everything. But then when you're on the ground with a kiln and you're trying to get all that material to go away, then it's really all this slash must be turned into biochar. And then you kind of, it becomes difficult to do a complete slash treatment with the biochar tools to have it all be the right amount of capacity, I guess is the point, because the kilns can only make so much. Okay. Hi, Kelpie. What's up?
Hi, we need to move on.
Okay.
And I'm sorry to cut you short.
No problem.
But thank you so much for sharing that experience. I mean, that's really difficult stuff to talk about. and you're cutting edge. You're in the middle of a whole slew of different practices that you're trying to harmonize. So really appreciate the thoughtfulness that you have brought to this. And what you've shared is going to be very, very valuable to everybody who wants to do these projects. So hang on with us for a little bit. We have one more speaker in this panel, and then there's quite a few questions for you, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you.
So, thank you very much, guys. And so now we have Mark Vander, and we're having a little trouble getting him online here. Do we have audio from Mark? Can Mark say something?
He's not muted.
Okay, Mark, can you raise your voice? Okay, I think Mark, I'm gonna call you and see if we can get you on my phone. And broadcast you from my phone. We can do this. So, hi, Mark.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to do it this way.
Yeah, we will. Speak up and say a few words.
This is Mark Vandermeer from Missoula, Montana.
How's that sound, John?
Sounds great.
Okay, great. So Mark, I'm just going to introduce you. So Mark Vandermeer is a restoration ecologist, forester, soil scientist, and ISA certified arborist. He's the principal partner at Watershed Consulting in Missoula, Montana. He's been with the company since 1998. He's the senior restoration ecologist with more than 30 years of experience in ecological restoration and biophysical assessments. Mark's a USDA certified soil scientist and an ISA certified arborist. Mark has developed many innovative revegetation and soil stabilization techniques. He's the lead author for 3 regional revegetation manuals. Mark is continually learning and teaching restoration and forest management techniques throughout Western Montana. So Mark, I'm going to share your slides for you. Can you see the screen?
I can see you just fine.
Okay. So you can see your slides then.
I can see.
When
You
I
just
get
brought
this.
them up.
Here we go.
Yeah, just make them big.
Okay, you can see that?
Yes.
All right, take it away, Mark, and just say next when you want me to advance the slides.
All right, next. Yeah, my name is Mark Vandermeer from Watershed Consulting. My presentation is going to be short because Dan and Joe and Ken have covered all the problems, and we've faced all these very same issues, and it's really great to hear that everybody else is having these same issues. I've been working in slash management for 20 years or so, and it's in research first and then as applied. So our goal in this biochar stuff was to knock off the waste in the woods and do some good forest restoration and not have those big piles burning up. The money from this, from our little project came from the DNRC, Montana DNRC, and it was part of a collaborative effort. We were a very, very small part of that. We just did 21 acres of thinning and biochar. And the University of Montana are the ones who are actually doing this study. And what I'm showing you today is just the very preliminary findings from our work on the ground. I'm going to let those folks at the university worry about the graphs and charts and whatnot. The grant for the thinning came from Nrcs. And like you guys have said, whoa, it can be a mess. We thinned 60 acres of lop and scatter and did a good job. You know how hard it is to do lop and scatter correctly. And the NRCS changed its mind, even though we had it in writing. So it was pretty bad. We had to go back and deal with all of our lop and scatter, and they wanted it all picked up, and that's where the kilns came in. Okay, the site stats here, that's good. Pre-thinning conditions, we had 21 acres of mixed conifer, just the normal species for around here. The density was about 1,500 stems an acre, so fairly thick. Elevation is mid elevation of 4,500, and the slopes were gentle-ish. We stayed clear of those pitches over 20% with the kilns. That doesn't work so well. Post thinning, we thinned down. We thinned the stand in 2020. We took about 1,000 trees out per acre, and like I said, we were doing the lop and scatter treatment, and allowed 1 year for drying time. And this was all by accident. We didn't mean to ever have to pick this stuff up again, but it did dry nicely. And then we converted this stuff to biochar in the fall of 2021, the spring and fall of 2021. And we used one of Kelpie's kilns. Next slide. This is the rate and cost table. This is what we charge people per hour. And this whole project at 21 acres came out to $42,000. And you can just see the different rates there. I rent those kilns out at $25 a day. We had 85 burns, but 55 kiln days. We had a 2-ton water truck and all those miscellaneous tools. So I really tried to include everything in here in the costs so that I would have a realistic idea if this is feasible into the future. Next slide. There we go. These are just 2 of our crew putting the kiln together. I heard somebody earlier mentioning Tom DeLuca. I think he's running the forestry department in Oregon right now at the university. That kid there on the right is Henry DeLuca. That's Tom's kid. And I studied with Tom back in the day. So we're getting a little bit of a soils legacy here. These kilns, we like them a lot. We got pretty quick at putting them together, and we found them really well thought out, and I'd use them again. Okay, next slide. This piece of equipment was really important, and I'm talking about the guy in the yellow shirt, Kurt Von Kleist. He ran this operation and did a heck of a job. He's very efficient, and he yells at people a lot, so they run. The Kubota there, also very important. We couldn't have done this work without it. It got water where it needed to be. Most of our quenching was done via gravity feed. And so we were constantly buzzing around with this vehicle and getting it into really tight spots upslope of our burning operation. So that tank on the back is 125 gallons. And it took us about 60 gallons per kiln to quench it. Next slide. Oh, there's me if you're wondering what I look like. There's just a kiln in action. Most of our material was under the 1,000-hour fuel range, under 3 inches. And the bigger stuff when it did accidentally get in the kiln, didn't burn that well. And we really wanted to keep that big stuff in the woods anyway. The Nrcs was not thrilled with that. They wanted us to pick up everything, and we fought them constantly. And it was really tough. And but we managed to leave about 6 to 8 tons per acre of the bigger stuff, and we had to clean up all that little stuff, even though it would have decomposed in no time. You can see here, this is your these things. We're moving through the woods pretty quick. This is an efficient operation, so it takes about 3 hours per burn. Unlike some of you folks, ours are real easy to light, especially after a year on the ground. It takes a match in 30 seconds, and the fire on top stays very nice, and it throws that heat below it and gasifies that stuff and makes a nice batch of charcoal. And it's safe, and it's darn near smokeless. Next slide. Just another shot. This is along an old skid road, and we did not stage fuels beforehand. We did it all just kiln by kiln. And you know, you don't want to handle slash twice. So we might have had some guys dragging it in and letting this guy put it in, but we generally drug the kilns around instead of dragging slash around. Next slide. This is the yield. It's about 1.3 cubic yards per burn. But remember, these are small burns, and we're moving through the woods pretty quick. And at 1.3 cubic yards per burn and 60 gallons of water for quenching, it turned out to be a pretty efficient operation. Not too bad. And we like the quality of this stuff. We have another retort at our sawmill where we make a higher quality product, mostly for blacksmithing forges, and it's very different. But this stuff's all right. Next slide. This is the last slide too.
No, there's one more.
Oh, is there? That's fine. This is a plot radius per acre. This is kind of a funny thing, just in my mind. We found that you're really wasting your time if you're walking over 55 feet from the kiln. Each kiln can deal with about 1/5 of an acre of cleanup. So at 55 feet, you're right there at about 1/5 of an acre, and you really don't want to clean up all your slash. So 50 feet is about all you want to drag it. All right, last slide. Yeah, this is a summary. We had 85 kilns burned, about 1.3 cubic yards per kiln. The cost per acre was $2,014, and we thought that was really high. Now that I've seen that stuff in California, I feel like a superstar. We're doing all right. Our total yield was 112 cubic yards, and so that's about 5.4 per acre. Not too bad, especially with a residence time of 500 years. I feel that's a real contribution. And then the cost for this stuff, if you break it down by the cubic yard, is $376. But that doesn't include all the environmental services, of course. And like I said before, each kiln treated about 20–25% of an acre. That should do it. The big question people should ask is, would I do it again? Yeah, you bet. Money allowed. This is a great way to treat slash, and it's fun. People love to do it, and I probably could have done it with volunteers, but we really like to pay people and make this a true career. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And by the way, I didn't pay this guy. So
No, I paid you.
that's right. All right. So we're at the end of the panel and we've got quite a few questions. Mark, stay on the line, please, so you can answer some questions.
Okay.
And let's see here. What have we got? I'm losing my Q&A. Where did it go? Sorry, guys, I gotta.
Click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It'll
I
pop up again.
The slideshow took off my whole screen. Okay. Q&A. All right. Let's go start back with, is Laurie? Laurie, you're there, you're back, great. So there are a few questions for you. Here's one from Jim. Who pays for the soil and biochar tests for the 386 practice?
Great question. So you can ask to have Conservation Practice Standard 217, which is soil and source testing, to be contracted with the 336, and that can be used to pay for testing and can be contracted through the Conservation Practice, or EQIP, I should say. And
great. And another question from Jeff about EQIP. Will this soil carbon amendment 336 become part of EQIP?
yes.
Yes, it already is, right?
Right.
And will this apply to next spring and summer after the next round of EQIP eligibility, or when would be the earliest that this would take into effect?
That's a good question, and you really need a crystal ball, unfortunately, for that one, because as I noted, it's 45 days. What I didn't say is after the 45-day period, we actually have to put together bundles of conservation practices to be routed through USDA as well as outside USDA for review and approval to have them posted in the Federal Register. And it has been taking 6 months for that to happen. So, but normally it takes about 3 months. So it just depends on how long or how quickly that packet can go through. I think they're really trying to expedite this conservation practice standard so that hoping that'll be implemented or ready for FY23. But I can't give you an exact date of when it's going to be available.
Okay. Question from Karen. Is there any way to participate in these CSP programs if the local NRCS office does not regard them as important and doesn't even rank them in their project priorities?
Ooh, good question. And that's a tough one because that's really done at the state level. They're the ones that make that determination.
And so different regions are different ecologically. So some regions might not see that as a priority. Let's see. Is there a minimum acreage requirement for the NRCS 384A?
384A, I think 2 acres.
2 acres.
Well, actually, I don't know that there is even a minimum acre. That's what we use for develop the payment schedule for it.
Okay. Let's see. Are land grant universities going to be able to start testing carbon content of soil and biochar so we can accurately recommend how much to apply? That is a huge obstacle for us in the Pacific Islands area.
Yeah, I'd have to check. I have no idea on that one. Sorry. I can ask our soil health folks and get back to Kelpie on that. So that's a good question.
And then Eric asks, so when working with NRCS, biochar production must be considered at the beginning of the process to get additional cost and implementation considered for the grant. So I guess that's a question that it's hard to add biochar on to an existing project. I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, you mean for contracts? Yes, you'd actually have to have a separate contract.
Okay. All right, let's see. And Todd asks, are NRCS 336 and 384 being used in the Midwest or only in the West?
The enhancement 384A is primarily for the West because it's for fuels reduction.
Okay. And let's see. I don't know if there's some other questions that had typed answers. Roger asks, and I think this is a question for Mark, how many bone dry tons of material was removed in that 21 acres?
Wow, what a great question. I don't know. That's one of those things I'm going to let the university deal with. I can, if you know the weight of about 1,000 3 to 4 inch basal diameter trees, that's your answer, and then dry it.
Okay. And I think this is most of the questions. There's a few kind of general ones. We've got another minute or two. Somebody's asking about burning in a trench. Has anybody done any burning in pits, soil pits? Maybe Ken, do you know anything about that?
I haven't, but I was wondering if Don has, if he's still on, because Scott McCain has, and I think it was, pretty successful, and that's something I've been thinking about in terms of the work on Guam, and I think Dave Komorowski is on the call. It sounds like because he's talking about the islands. And that's something where I think I think that's a super valuable in the case of trying to reverse the development of badlands in those areas where there's a progressive, negative positive feedback loop, but it's a vicious cycle where as the land begins to erode, it just feeds on itself. And if you could burn a lot of the bamboo and African tulip tree and some of their invasive species in those trenches, you can create sort of islands of redevelopment of that native vegetation. And another place I just did a project on Martha's Vineyard, and they have problem with runoff starting to foul their oyster beds. And that's where I think making char in trenches that can intercept that groundwater and pull some of the nutrients out of it before it goes into the oyster bed. So there's a lot of, I mean, not only is it effective according to Scott McCain, but I think then being able to do it in a situation where you're not trying to then harvest that char out of there and spread it on the forest. If it's designed to stay in the trench, I think that's the way to go. But if you're trying to then take that char and move it back out into the forest, number one, you're disturbing the soil in the first place. So you're releasing carbon every time you do that, right? And then what's going to happen to that, char once it sits in that trench for a while? So those are the kinds of things to think about, I think, when you're thinking about working with trenches or pits.
And it's got to have a conservation use, especially for NRCS. So I got a question from our Oregon NRCS last year. They had someone who wanted to just dig big pits, throw a bunch of logs in there, light it on fire, kind of like that traditional biochar method I was showing you early this morning, and then get credit for that. And I said, for NRCS especially, it seems to me like it's got to have a useful purpose on the land. And so that, just making biochar like that to leave it in the pit for carbon sequestration isn't enough. Laurie, do you want to comment on that idea?
On the pits, you mean?
Yeah, on the idea of just making biochar in a pit and leaving it for carbon sequestration without using it to achieve some other conservation objective.
That's a good one.
I think in Oregon, NRCS decided that would not meet the objective of the
Yeah, I think, you're supposed to produce the biochar and then I think use it. And as Ken pointed out, you could actually improve the soil health in the pit, and that maybe help native plants get restored. But we're really, the whole point of this is to produce biochar, but I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one.
Okay.
I think we actually leave it, when we develop enhancements, or even practices at the national level, we create them so that they're national level. So then we allow the states to have the flexibility to implement it as it works for their state. So they can add additional restrictions. So it sounds like in Oregon that they're not accepting that as an appropriate use of the biochar for when you're doing the enhancement.
Thanks for that explanation that it's different by the state level, because I think a lot of people have trouble getting their minds around that. I got a question for Joe and Dan. How do you usually bid or estimate biochar projects? By the acre, by the job, hourly? What's the best approach?
Most often we do projects on an hourly basis. And that just tends to be that we work on pretty specific habitat gigs and kind of maybe more challenging terrain and that kind of thing. But also sometimes, things are just bid like by the acre. That's very typical of larger contracts, that things are bid on an acreage basis, but the further specialized you get, the harder it is to do that type of thing. But so we tend to often just be hourly.
Yeah, and a lot of times, like in the story we were telling, but in other situations, we're doing multiple treatments. So it'd be like slash manage, or cutting the trees, doing the thinning, and then preparing the feedstock, and then coordinating with the biochar kiln. So it's just like one practice after another, and we just usually have a hourly rate throughout all of that.
So that makes it hard for you to tell the landowner how much it's going to cost, because you need to know.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very true. And, now there are some landowners that are like, do whatever I want you to do it. I don't care. I have endless pocketbooks, but most landowners are not that way. So part of what was our struggle with our experience was there's this large number associated with per acre treatment with NRCS. And so once you have a contract to make biochar with NRCS, there's sort of this expectation of, it might be hard and inefficient, but we're going to be able to make this work because of that big number and the variety of different enhancements, which is kind of a trap, because unless you have all that stuff written out and it's very clear, then you can either have cost overrun, or after we're done, it can be like, no, actually all this other stuff needs to happen in order to comply with what we were expecting. And then that puts everybody in a jam. So I think that number is a distraction kind of from figuring this stuff out sometimes.
Great. So here's a question from Peter. How can a qualified contractor connect with specific opportunities to fill the need for experience and expertise? So, like you guys to take a crack at that, but also maybe Mark wants to address that question. So can you, Dan and Joe, do you have recommendations for contractors who want to do this work? How they would find it? How do they find the job?
Well, yeah, we'd like to know too. We tend to be pretty busy, and for us personally, it's word of mouth and it's references from other things. Like, and we have a master contract like with the Watershed Council, so we get work comes in that way. But most often it's just landowners connecting with each other, maybe through small woodland owner groups and things like that. I mean, I know for me personally, starting out, it was kind of challenging because we're sort of outside the box. We're not arborists, we're not loggers, we're not certified foresters. We're kind of like in between. We're doing this work. There's a niche here, and it's pretty specific. So it's a challenge, but just, it's a lot of networking and it's a lot of doing very high quality work.
All right. And one of the things I was impressed when I first met you guys at the Long Tom project was that you're each independent contractors. So you have your own insurance and your own business practices, but you can hook up together and work together on jobs where it needs more than one person. So I think that's an interesting business model for people just getting started who don't want to take on employees, et cetera.
Yeah, it's team up with other contractors. Don't go into it as competition. Just talk candidly about what you bring to the table, whether it's your water trailer or you have a kiln or what other experiences. So yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. So Mark, do you have a comment on that? And then we'll wrap up this question session.
Nothing to add really, about the same kind of experience. It doesn't get any easier as the years go by either, because the landowners change and the agency folks change even quicker.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you've stuck with it for quite a while, so there must have some rewards.
Sure.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for this session.